Mason Evans had just moved to a small town in the north of Maine, but he'd already managed to fall in love with the vast forests and rivers that this wonderful land has long been famous for. The man didn't move there alone, but together with his wife, Rachel, and their 7-year-old son, Bobby. The family decided to move because the doctors recommended for the boy to live in a cool climate, which they believed would be good for him. That's why Mason sold his property in Alabama and purchased a small house which stood near the forest. The air in this area was so fresh and clean that Mason felt like he couldn't breathe enough of it. The climate will certainly help Bobby regain his strength after the long treatment, the man thought, never ceasing to admire the view of the majestic forest. Mason also liked watching his son's enthusiastic reaction at the sight of a deer crossing the road or hearing a wolf howl at night. The fact was that Bobby had recently overcome a serious illness that he's been suffering from almost his entire life. Most doctors were scared of their responsibility and gave a disappointing prognosis, and only one of the medical centers decided that they could help the boy. However, it meant that Bobby's parents had to agree to a surgery, the outcome of which no one could predict. But there was no other way to save the boy, so Rachel and Mason gave their consent. The unfortunate parents no longer had the strength to watch their son slowly fade away, not having the slightest chance of getting better on his own. On the day of the surgery, Mason kissed his son, and Rachel prayed quietly. Being in the waiting room, the parents literally couldn't find a place for themselves. They were worried out of their minds, looking anxiously at the doors of the operating room. Fortunately, thanks to the professionalism of the doctors and innovative methods of the treatment, the surgery was over and it was a success. Bobby was saved. The boy's further treatment required only medications, proper nutrition, and fresh air. Bobby had more than enough of it all now, because Maine was considered to be one of the most picturesque places in the United States. Trying to get his son to spend more time outside, Mason took the boy with him into the forest, telling him all the secrets of the wild. Rachel was always surprised by the deep knowledge of her husband in this area. "Honey, how do you know so much about the forest? You grew up on a farm in Alabama, didn't you?" the woman asked one day, looking at her husband with admiration. "Rachel, you know my story. I don't remember anything from my past. I can only share what they told me in the orphanage," Mason answered, touching his forehead with his palm. Rachel nodded sadly in response and went into the kitchen to make some dinner. Of course, she remembered her husband's sad story well. Rachel knew that Mason ended up in an orphanage at the age of 5. Unfortunately, the boy didn't remember his parents at all, or what had happened so that he ended up in an orphanage. The little orphan only knew that his name was Mason. A 5-year-old boy was brought in by a stranger who noticed him at the train station. The caretakers of the orphanage did everything they could to restore Mason's memory, but all their efforts were in vain. The boy couldn't remember who he was or how he got to the train station of the largest city in Alabama. Even the police and social services who tried to find Mason's parents couldn't help. It seemed that the boy appeared out of nowhere, having neither parents nor relatives. Over time, Mason got used to the fact that his past was a mystery, which seemed to be impossible to solve. Everyone saw him as yet another orphan who lived and studied at the orphanage. And even now, walking with his son through the forest, Mason couldn't explain how he knew so much about nature and the wildlife. The man could unmistakably distinguish an elk's footprint from a footprint left by a deer or a wild boar. Moreover, Mason knew all kinds of mushrooms and berries very well, which always grew in abundance in local forests. "Bobby, how do you feel about going to the eastern part of the forest today to pick up mushrooms for dinner? It rained a lot last week, which means our baskets could be filled with great mushrooms before noon," Mason asked, looking out the window. "Sure, Daddy, I'd love to. And I'm sure I'll pick more mushrooms than you," Bobby answered with a joyful smile on his face. Okay. Don't be so sure of yourself. We'll see who wins," Mason replied jokingly, rejoicing at the upcoming walk with his son. The fact was that after the rainstorms that had lasted for almost an entire week, the sun had finally peeked out from behind the clouds, and the weather was finally nice in Maine. In order not to wet his clothes on the wet grass and branches, Bobby put on his rubber boots and a raincoat, which made him look like a real mushroom picker or a fisherman. Looking approvingly at his son's getup, Mason smiled and handed him a wicker basket. Then the man kissed his wife goodbye and headed for the eastern part of the forest, which he hadn't yet been to. At first, Bobby cautiously walked near his father, constantly looking around. And then, gotten used to this part of the forest, the boy allowed himself to step away from his dad. There were a lot of mushrooms, so the father and son found them literally under every bush. Suddenly, Bobby, who was walking in front, yelped in surprise and began to back away. "What happened, son? Do you need help?" Mason asked anxiously, rushing to the boy. Having caught up with Bobby, the man took him by the shoulders, but to his surprise, his son didn't turn around. Instead, the boy pointed forward and said, "Dad, what is this?" Mason followed the boy's hand and then screamed out in surprise when he saw what was there. The fact was that the boy accidentally stumbled upon some abandoned cemetery. Parts of it were covered with fern and wolfberry bushes. The tombstones were partially destroyed and covered with a layer of moss and lichen. But that wasn't what was so shocking to Mason. The most terrifying thing was that the nearest tombstone had his childhood photo on it. The letters of the tombstone were mostly unreadable, but the man did manage to make out the first letter of the name, which was an M. "Oh God, what is it? This can't be happening," exclaimed Mason, turning pale. But there was no mistake, and the man had no doubt. Mason immediately recognized his childhood photo, and now, standing in front of the tombstone with his picture on it, he didn't know what to do next. "Dad, who is this boy? It isn't you, is it?" asked Bobby timidly, who saw his father's photos in the family album, and therefore immediately recognized his father in the picture. "I don't know, son. This is probably some kind of mistake," Mason said, stammering on every word. However, even the man himself didn't believe what he was saying, because he knew that it was definitely him in the picture. Mason was also upset by the fact that he couldn't understand why traces of his past found him in the dense forest of Maine, because he grew up in Alabama and had never been to the northeast of the country. Moreover, the man was unsettled by the sad state of the cemetery. From the way it looked, Mason concluded that no human had set foot there for at least several years. "Bobby, I think we need to go home," the man said, having a hard time tearing his eyes away from the sad sight. Then, taking his son by the hand, Mason led him home, where their mother was already waiting for them. Rachel was genuinely surprised that her husband and son returned from the forest with half-empty baskets. But when Mason told her what they'd found in the forest, the woman turned pale and couldn't believe her ears at first. But when Rachel realized that her husband wasn't joking, she said, "Honey, it seems to me that your past has found you in the deep forest of Maine. I think it's as good an opportunity as any to find out who your parents were and how you ended up in Alabama." Mason was grateful to his wife. She was always great at supporting him. The man decided he would start off by asking the old-timers of the city about who owned the abandoned cemetery in the middle of the forest. The next day, Mason woke up earlier than usual. He had a quick breakfast and a cup of coffee and went to the information desk. Unfortunately, none of the employees could remember anything about the graveyard in the forest or who was buried there. When Mason started fearing that he would never be able to get to the truth, one of the employees advised him to visit Abram Smith. He was an old man living out his last days in a nursing home. Finally, it seemed that Mason would get to learn something that had been bothering him all these long years. Mr. Smith turned out to be a half-blind, nearly deaf old man who, despite his age, had an excellent memory. Mr. Smith told Mason that there was a camp of illegal lumberjacks in the eastern part of the forest 30 years ago. They were engaged in illegal logging and subsequent sale of elite tree species. Mr. Smith also kept repeating that the residents of that camp were vicious people with questionable morals who were even capable of murder. They also had their own cemetery and a small wooden church. It was one of these lumberjacks that Rebecca Lopez met. She was an orphan who came to our town from Kentucky, the old man added. "Mr. Smith, I'm sorry, but what does this have to do with me and that cemetery in the woods?" asked Mason, burning with curiosity. The old man chuckled and in response said, Be patient, young man. We'll get there. As I said, Rebecca Lopez was in a relationship with one of the lumberjacks from that camp, which ended with her getting pregnant. They weren't married at the same time because the lumberjacks lived by their own laws and didn't believe in marriage. Then, Rebecca gave birth to twin boys, whom she named. God help, what were their names? Michael and Mason, prompted the man, who already started getting an idea of what had happened. Yes, you're right. That was his name, Mason. So, when the boys were 5 years old, Rebecca decided to leave the village, tired of living in inhuman and unsanitary conditions. Unfortunately, the father of the twins was against her decision, so Rebecca decided to run away on a dark July night. But the lumberjack immediately noticed the absence of his wife and sons. Grabbing his gun, he rushed after them. The madman caught up to them at the edge of the forest. With his first shot, he killed the mother of the twins and seriously wounded one of the boys. Local residents heard the sound of gunfire and immediately called the police, who arrested the lumberjack right there near Rebecca's body. This bastard is still serving life in federal prison. The camp of lumberjacks was immediately disbanded and its residents were sent out of the city. Unfortunately, the wounded boy died in the hospital, but the fate of his brother remains unknown to this day. Mr. Smith said, squinting his eyes. "This boy is now standing in front of you," Mason whispered, tears flowing down his face. He remembered how he ran as fast as he could, frightened by the shots. His legs brought him to the railway station, where he climbed into the first train that he came across. The train went all the way to Alabama, which explained how the 5-year-old Mason ended up in that state. Because of the stress he lived through, the boy's brain erased all memories of what had happened to him in the forest. Taking the old man by the hand, Mason cried his eyes out. It seemed to him that a huge weight was lifted off his shoulders, which was holding him down all those long 25 years. Now he knew who his real parents were and owned a graveyard in the dense forest. Having told his wife and his son all he found out, Mason went to the forest the next morning, where he cleared the forest cemetery and put the tombstones in order. Standing at his brother's grave, Mason believed that Michael was now looking at him from heaven and was glad that he had finally found peace of mind.